Hi guys, it's wrap up time for $10 Modern Elves. We ended up going 3-2, and I mean, it went about like I thought it would early. I was hoping we would do a little better than 3-2. I was hoping we could get the 4-1, but we did hit two decks that were both not great matchups for us. I think we had an okay shot against Eldrazi-tron, just because they only run, I think, usually 2 copies of that sweeper in the main board and an extra one in the sideboard, so the chances of hitting it even post board aren't super high, but they had it both games. There's not much you can do when they have it, and yeah, I mean, wipers are what we die to, so we're a turn slower than probably normal elves, or maybe half a turn slower than normal elves, and so decks with lots of sweepers like that tend to get us, and Tron sweepers are especially bad because there's really no good mass way to survive those sweepers. They're either exile effects, like exile all creatures, or sacrifice effects, which get around indestructible, get around hexproof, get around regenerate, get around all that good stuff. So those matchups I think were a little hard for us in general. And let's get into talking about the deck and the good and the bad. Let's go over the check marks first. I think most of them are pretty obvious. Heritage Druid is kind of the key piece to this card. I said it early on. Our opponents removed it whenever they could, and if they didn't remove it, a lot of times we just went off with mana. Likewise, Elvish Archdruid, if it stuck around for a turn, a lot of times that tapped for massive mana and kind of powered out a lot of threats. And then Ezuri is just super necessary, even though it's only a 2 of. It gives us the kind of power to burst through and do enough damage to kill our opponent. And then the underperformers. So some of these X's are a little weak. I do feel like Imperious Perfect is a little slow, probably one of our less good options, but like I said, we needed a Lord or some other good elf, and it was just sitting there pretty cheap. Felt like a good include for that reason, but I don't know if it was. It's certainly not optimal in the deck. It might have made sense with the prices. By the way, I updated the price because the price changed since I filmed the first video, the deck tech. It's actually come down about $1, which is pretty nice. Actually, almost $2. So you could even fit maybe slightly better cards in here if you looked around. Sylvan Messenger, I actually kind of went back and forth about whether to put Sylvan Messenger here or Lys Alana. They both have the same problem. 4 mana feels a little clunky and hard in this deck, especially when you're trying to combo off. They both have the same advantages and the same disadvantages in a lot of ways. They're kind of important to comboing off. We need the ability to draw more cards, and we need a Lys Alana Huntmaster type effect to keep generating mana as we go. But I ended up feeling like Lys Alana did a little bit more for us, and a lot of times Sylvan Messenger felt just like the thing you cast at the end and then didn't have enough mana to cast the elves you got off it. And then the last X, again, is a pretty weak one. It's just next to Elvish Visionary. Elvish Visionary is fine. It's just not exciting. The other thing that could have gotten an X is probably Arbor Elf. It's not that I think we should take it out. I just think that it might have made more sense to go down 2 Arbor Elves and just go up 2 Forests or something. And I think somebody suggests maybe Blaintog, that we also go up a single Nykthos maybe. I would not go up many because you really need that 1 green mana early on, and you don't want even a pretty slight chance of just having 2 Nykthos in hand would just be devastating to the deck. And you don't need that extra mana so much, but in most cases as a 1 of, it'll sometimes ramp you to 1,000,000 mana and be useful, and when it doesn't, it won't hurt you very much. So I do think that probably is a pretty good include, and that would also be something that you might take out an Arbor Elf for. Alright, so that's it. I mean, the rest of the things all performed reasonably. They're kind of middling. Lead the Stampede almost got a check. That one was very good. Yeah, and Dwynen's Elite also probably somewhat close to getting a check just because it combos so well with Heritage Druid. Alright, let's move on and talk about some suggestions. So both Zencyclopedia sent me a message on Reddit, and Blaintog, I think, left a comment on, I don't remember which video it was on, it might have been the deck tech itself, discussing things that they would change, and both of them mentioned adding Heroic Intervention instead of Rapid Vigor. It was funny, when I put in Rapid Vigor, I was like, man, I feel like there's some card that I heard of recently that does almost the same thing as Rapid Vigor, but does it better, and I just couldn't remember what it was, and it turns out Heroic Intervention is exactly the card I was thinking of, and I just couldn't remember. And it's definitely a big upgrade. It does cost about 50 cents per copy on Magic Online. I don't know, it might even be cheaper on paper, I'm not sure, but it does cost a tiny amount. But the fact that it gives you guys indestructible and hexproof is a big game. It means if your opponent's on single target removal, it can still be pretty nice. Like, it can save you from an Electrolyze, for instance. The indestructible makes it so that even if they use something like Wrath of God, which Rapid Vigor fails to stop because the Wrath of God, your creatures can't be regenerated, and Rapid Vigor explicitly regenerates. Heroic Invention would stop that. It would also stop some other weird cases like dealing lethal damage to your creatures twice in the same turn. So there's some like corner cases too where Heroic Intervention is better, and I just can't think of any explicit cases where Rapid Vigor is better. So I agree. I think Heroic Intervention is the card to use over Rapid Vigor. Same mana cost, but in the places we care about, it's pretty much strictly better than Rapid Vigor. Throne of the God Pharaoh is an interesting one. It has, at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. And so basically it's an extra win condition. Zencyclopedia pointed out to me that it gets around Ensnaring Bridge. I had seen it in a primer, and I kind of thought about putting it in too, but I didn't, mostly because I didn't think it was necessary, and I wanted to maximize my creatures so that I would get good hits off my 2 card draw spells, which are both very reliant on hitting creatures in a stack of 4 or 5 cards respectively. But I think as a one-of in the main board, just to help against decks that are really trying to lock us out with something like Ensnaring Bridge, or maybe an enchantments deck that's trying to stop us with, you know, Ghostly Prisons and Sphere of Safety, Throne of the God Pharaoh could be very good. And the Imperious Perfects just aren't that good anyway, so I think it probably makes sense to put in Throne of the God Pharaoh over Imperious Perfect. And the last thing Zencyclopedia mentioned as a potential sideboard card is Lifecraft Bestiary, which I had also, again, I had seen this in a primer and I had thought about putting it in, but I think he's right. I think in kind of control matchups, it will probably do more for you than Guttural Response. So the idea is, in a control matchup, rather than deal with the fact that they're countering all, like, rather than try to counter their counters, you just play Lifecraft Bestiary. Whenever they counter something, you get to pay 1 extra when on a cast trigger of that creature that they're countering, and then draw a card off it. So even if they counter the creature, you get to draw another card, which is probably a creature anyway, and then on your upkeep you also get to scry to keep you going towards more action. So overall, I think it's a pretty good sideboard card in control type matchups, or any matchup where you think they're going to either be countering or even just killing a lot of your creatures. It'll keep you drawing creatures over time. It will slow your deck down a little bit, so you don't want it in like aggro type decks, which is the reason I think it makes the most sense to relegate to the sideboard, but it's still a very interesting choice, and I think better than the sideboard choice we had there. I wanted to get into the upgrade path and kind of what the normal full price version of Elves does versus what we're doing, and why I made these choices. So basically, we have Heritage Druid, we managed to afford it. The thing that makes Heritage Druid super strong is Nettle Sentinel, and the fact that whenever you cast a green spell, you get to untap Nettle Sentinel, and it counts as a mana towards Heritage Druid again. So you can do the same kind of thing that Lys Alana does. It doesn't put out another body, but it untaps Nettle Sentinel, and you can just kind of keep generating mana like this. If you have 2 Nettle Sentinels out, any creature spell you play is going to generate you 3 mana, basically. So there's kind of pros and cons to each one. The biggest pro is that Nettle Sentinel only costs 1 mana, and that is a huge pro. That means we can get it out early, and it basically makes our deck somewhere between half a turn and a turn faster. So if you can afford Nettle Sentinel, I think they're the way to go over Lys Alana. The problem is, on Magic Online, they're about $7 or $8 each, and Lys Alana is like 2 cents or something. They're a little cheaper in paper. They're only like $2. So in paper they might make more sense, but for the online version I felt like I couldn't put them in just because it took the deck from being a $10 deck to being a $40 deck, basically, or $50 deck, somewhere in that range. I think the reason they're so high on Magic Online in particular is they get a lot of play in Pauper, both in Elves and Green Stompy and Pauper, which is a pretty popular format on Magic Online because it's so cheap to get into, and you know it's a popular card in one of the top tier decks, and it also just only has 1 printing, so not a whole lot of copies floating around out there, and there's a lot of demand for it. And then I talked about a couple other pros and cons. Most of these aren't important. Nettle Sentinel works with Collecting Company, which the powered up version uses, which the budget one obviously doesn't, since those are like $20 a copy at this point. The Lys Alana Huntmaster generates extra elf bodies, which is actually a pretty nice bonus. It means when we do go off with Lys Alana, we actually go off a lot harder. It's just usually with Nettle Sentinel, you'll still go off for 50 damage. The difference is, like, do you kill your opponent by swinging for 50 and getting lethal, or do you swing your opponent by swinging for 250 and getting lethal, like I showed you in that intro slide? You know, it's like, it's a little bit of a, Lys Alana ends up being a little bit of a win more, so that pro isn't super important. But it is still a pro, and it's the reason that I have it there. And in fact, the Lys Alana doing this actually kind of makes Throne of the God Pharaoh better in our version of the deck than it would be in a normal elf version of the deck, because we have so many of those creatures that we're generating off of Lys Alana that we actually do even more damage just from having them all tapped at end of turn. It's also a 3/3 instead of a 2/2, and it's slightly harder to kill with Fatal Push because of its converted mana cost. And Eugen too, just like random little things like that. Having higher converted mana cost has a few tiny perks, but in general, if you could choose, you would take Nettle Sentinel. We just didn't do it because it's $7 or $8 a copy. All right, so that was the first upgrade I wanted to talk about. Then I wanted to talk about the next upgrade and the pros and cons. And this one's a pretty interesting one. So pretty much all full-priced versions of Elves run for Collected Company. Collected Company is very good. It can be used at instant speed, which is actually a super big game. So if your opponent has a board wipe, you can often generate mana, wait for the board wipe to resolve, play out Collected Company or Court of Calling, and then with that, start to rebuild your board even though you're on your opponent's turn. And even if you have nothing in hand other than the Collected Company or Court of Calling, again, you can start to rebuild your board. So I think that's a pretty big deal. It also gives you a little bit more selection. Lead the Stampede and Sylvan Messenger run 4 and 5 deep respectively. Collected Company digs 6 deep for the piece you need, and Court of Calling literally tutors any creature out of your deck based on the converted mana cost you pump into it. So you get a lot more good selection with Court of Calling and Collected Company, whereas we're left up to the whim of our deck. Could be that our last 2 cards in our whole deck are Ezuri, and it makes it very hard for us to win. Specifically, the selection from Court of Calling lets us play the deck a little bit like a toolbox deck. We can play like a 1 or 2 of, like, well, mostly 1 of. So we can play 1 of a couple different cards and like fetch them when we need to. Sometimes you want to bring them in for your sideboard just because you don't want to dilute your main deck too much, but I see Reclamation Sage run a lot. Kitchen Finks run occasionally. I think that one might be more of a sideboard card. Scavenging Ooze run a lot. Malira, or whatever it's called, run quite a bit. You know, basically, if there's a card that just beats a matchup, I think Spellskite they run occasionally. If there's a card that just beats a matchup, a lot of times you'll run it as a 1-of in your deck, because the price for running it as a 1-of over another elf usually isn't that high. But the fact that you just get free wins off certain decks by having it in your deck and being able to court for it is actually really high. So that is a pretty sweet effect of Court of Calling in the deck. But the budget ones we're running actually do have some pretty nice bonuses. If you're running a 40 creature deck like we are, Sylvan Messenger gets you on average, I think I calculated, I forget whether it was 2.6 or 2.7, but right around very close to 3 elves on average out of the 4 you look at. And Lead the Stampede gives you about 3.3. I think I mentioned that during the videos. I wasn't 100% sure on the math, but yeah, it's about 3.3. So on average, both of them give you significantly more cards than Court of Calling or Collected Company, and you have to cast them, which sucks. The Court of Calling and Collected Company go directly out onto the battlefield, but the fact that it gives you more cards is a pretty big deal. It's slower. Again, that's one of the problems with the budget version of the deck, is it's a little bit slower, but it actually helps you grind a little bit more. As we saw in the 8-rack game, these were great, whereas Collected Company and Court of Calling wouldn't have done so much against that. I think I did a Lead the Stampede and got hit a 4 or 5 off it, and 8-rack was like, oh, we just spent 3 turns trying to get him to discard all his cards, and he's back up at like 5 or 6, you know? So definitely has its perks. The other thing that's nice is Sylvan Messenger gives us a body. I mean, it's important for tapping to Heritage Druid, and it's also nice for Lys Alana Huntmaster combo. Obviously, the other 2 don't have to care about that because they have Nettle Sentinel, and all 4 of these trigger Nettle Sentinel since they're all green spells. But in our deck, Sylvan Major has that little perk. And so what else did I want to talk about? I think Finishers is next. So I want to talk about the threats we didn't run and why we didn't run them. So Craterhoof Behemoth and Shaman of the Pack are kind of the 2 biggest threats that I see in Elves. I heard some people in the primer talking about Mirror Entity, and I wanted to include it, if for no other reason than it's one of my favorite cards, even though I know it's not good in many decks. It's just, I love it. I love how it plays. I just think it's super fun. But yeah, Craterhoof we didn't run, partly because it's just a little bit too expensive. Also, most decks that run it as a 1-of and kind of like, you know, tutor for it off of a giant Court of Calling or something like that, which we don't have the ability to do since we don't run Court of Calling. So it would be very random whether we got it or not, and you really only want it, you know, on that last turn when you can cast it and win with it. So I think for that reason, Craterhoof just wouldn't have made the cut for us anyway, but it's also $4, which put it out of budget. Shaman on the Pack, on the other hand, was in budget, but it and Mirror Entity both have the same problem. They require us to go a second color, and given the price point of this deck, we just can't afford the lands to go that second color, even though those cards themselves are very cheap. So yeah, if I had to build an ideal version of the deck, it would definitely include at least Shaman of the Pack. It can kind of fill the same role that Throne of the God Pharaoh does, where it gives you a good way to do a lot of damage without actually attacking. So pretty sweet. So those are the threats, and then I wanted to do a full-priced version of the deck just to show you what I think, if I had to build the deck, approximately what it would look like. So it runs about $250 as opposed to $10, I guess $265 here, which is a lot more money. If you look at where that money is going to, about $100 is going into collecting companies, and about $100 is going to Cavern of Souls. And those are super expensive cards that are used on a lot of decks. Just can't get away from that price. And then there's some other pretty expensive ones. Like I said, Nettle Sentinel I think is the third most expensive at $32. That's the reason we had to cut that one. And then Court of Calling is only $5 each, but also pretty expensive. I saw some running 4 Court of Callings. I saw some running 2 Court of Callings and 2 or 3 Lead the Stampedes. It kind of varied in there. A lot of decks I did see running 1 or 2 Lead the Stampedes just to help refill the hand, and I was like, yeah, well, we have them already. Not a bad idea. It does become significantly weaker when we're dealing with 34 creatures like this, because I think it is at 34 creatures. I think it's actually slightly under 3 at that point, like 2.8 or 2.7. I'd have to redo the math. I looked it up at some point. But yeah, very good. I upped the land count in here, partly because we don't need as high land count when we're running Court of Calling and Collected Company. It's a little bit less important since we're not hoping to hit like 4 or 5 creatures off of our Lead the Stampedes, but also just because I think the mana count was a little low to begin with. It quite possibly should have been 17 or maybe even 18. 16 might have been a little aggressive. It did lead to some pretty awesome Lead the Stampedes where we hit 5 cards at once, but it was probably a little too greedy by me. What other changes did I make? I lowered the number of Elvish Visionaries slightly. I put in a couple threats to grab with Collected Company that I think win a lot of matchups. Scavenging Ooze is great in a couple different matchups, mostly matchups that use the graveyard, but also sometimes against aggro it can be kind of nice because its ability does gain you some life. And then Reclamation Sage destroys a target artifact or enchantment, and obviously there's a lot of those in the format. Then what else did I want to say? Obviously Shaman of the Pack is a 4 of in there. Like I said, it's 4 cents. They're a penny each, but really good if you can splash black. Splashing black isn't hard for us. If you look over at our lands, we have 4 Blooming Marsh, which tap for green or black, 4 Cavern of Souls, which tap for any color as long as we're paying for an elf, 4 Gilt Leaf Palace, which come into play untapped as long as you have an elf to reveal. And if you don't have an elf to reveal, you probably don't care very much about it coming in tapped anyway. And then 4 Forest, and then we have a couple utility lands. Pendelhaven is basically just a legendary forest with a nice little ability that can make it hard for your opponent to kill your elves in the early game. It can tap for green mana, or it can tap to give a 1/1 creature +1/+2, so it can save it from a few burn spells. It can make it a good blocker for a turn and aggro matchups. Just a utility land that's pretty easy to include if you have the $5 to pay for it. And then Westvale Abbey, I was actually torn between putting Westvale Abbey in here and putting Nykthos in here, which is I think what Blaine Tog suggested. I thought Westvale Abbey was kind of a better choice only because I don't think this deck, or at least this version of it, has that much trouble generating a lot of mana. I feel like what can happen is you can get in a state where you don't draw your win conditions, because there's really only there's the 4 Shaman of the Pack and the 2 Ezuris for win conditions. And the 4 Shaman of the Packs might not finish off your opponent, and then you're kind of stuck in this state where you have to just swing in dangerously against your opponent sometimes. So Westvale Abbey gives you a way to just sack a bunch of creatures and swing in with a 9/7 indestructible lifelink or whatever it is. I think that's what it is. Yeah, 9/7. So I thought that was a pretty good include. And yeah, that's the priced up version of the deck. $265 online, about $410 in paper. I think this would run pretty well. You could look at other versions on like MTG Goldfish or MTG Top 8 are both good places to find powered up versions of decks, and they both have a section for elf decks. They all kind of look vaguely like this. Alright, that's the deck for the week. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have suggestions. I will see you next time. Hey guys, Bobgar here. I just really wanted to quickly say, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. If you enjoy my content in general and would like to see more of it, subscribe. I'll be coming out with more content in the future. And please leave me comments and let me know what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong, both in terms of production and in terms of my play and my deck building and all that. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you guys next time.